I never thought a man I trusted could laugh at the death of my mother. I thought I knew him. I was wrong. But what happened next, when his boss walked in, left the entire room frozen, and it changed everything. Ladies and gentlemen, I need you to imagine something for me. The moment someone you love more than anything in this world passes away. Your heart is shattered, your soul feels hollow, and the grief. It's suffocating. Now imagine the person you call your husband, your partner, your confidant, laughs. Laughs, as if the pain, the loss, the very thing that defines your heartbreak, is some kind of joke. That was me. That was my reality. And in that moment, I realized that grief can reveal who people truly are. But life has a way of delivering justice in the most unexpected ways, and sometimes, the truth comes from the most unlikely place. That day, it came from his boss. I remember the day my mother passed like it was etched into my soul with fire. I remember waking up that morning with a heavy feeling in my chest, a sense of dread that I could not shake even though I tried to convince myself that everything would be fine. I had spent weeks preparing for this day, for her illness, for her fragile state, for the countless hospital visits, the endless medications, the nights I stayed awake beside her bed watching her struggle for every breath, every moment, feeling helpless yet determined to do everything in my power to ease her pain. And now the inevitable had come, and I was left to face it without the comfort of her presence. And I walked into the room where she lay, her hands pale and frail, her breathing shallow and uneven, and the silence was deafening. It was not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to think, hard to breathe, and hard to accept that she was really gone. And I called out her name softly, at first as if speaking would somehow bring her back, as if my voice had the power to undo death, but there was nothing, just the echo of my own fear bouncing back at me. And I sank to my knees beside her bed and let the tears fall freely, tears I had held back for weeks, tears that came from the deepest part of my being, tears that spoke of love and loss and all the moments I would never get to share again. And I felt a hand on my shoulder and turned to see him standing there, my husband, the man I thought I knew, the man I thought would be my rock and my comfort in this moment of unimaginable grief. And I expected at least sympathy, at least some semblance of understanding, at least a tear shed for the woman who had raised me, nurtured me, taught me how to be kind, how to be strong, how to love unconditionally. But what I saw instead was a look on his face that I will never forget, a look that chilled me to the bone, a smirk that curled his lips, as if this moment of unbearable sorrow was something amusing, something worthy of laughter. And I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind screaming in disbelief, my body paralyzed by the shock of it. How could he, how could the man I had shared my life with the one I had trusted with my deepest fears and my wildest dreams, laugh at my mother's death? And the sound came from him. It was low and mocking, a sound that should never exist in a room filled with mourning. And I stared at him, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what I was witnessing, unable to reconcile the image of the man I loved with the cruelty I was hearing. And I felt a surge of anger and hurt that was almost too much to bear, because grief on its own is heavy enough. It is a mountain that presses down on your shoulders, that makes every step feel impossible. But grief coupled with betrayal, grief coupled with the knowledge that the person who vowed to love you in sickness and in health could treat your pain is a joke, it was almost unbearable. And I wanted to scream at him, I wanted to demand that he explain himself, I wanted to shake him and make him feel the depth of what he had done, but the words would not come. My throat felt tight, my voice caught somewhere deep inside me, and I just stared at him, and the room seemed to shrink around me as the reality settled in that he was not the man I thought he was. He was not my partner in this life. He was a stranger, a cruel stranger who had chosen laughter over compassion. And I could feel the weight of every memory we had shared pressing down on me, every anniversary, every birthday, every whispered promise, now tainted by the realization that I had been blind to the darkness in his heart. And I thought about my mother and the values she had instilled in me, the lessons about kindness, about integrity, about empathy. And I felt a wave of shame and sadness wash over me, because she was gone, and she would never know the depth of my suffering at his hands. She would never see the betrayal that had taken place in the room. She had loved him once, she had welcomed him into our family, and now he had shown his true face, and there was no undoing it. And I sank back onto the floor, tears streaming down my face, my hands clutching the sheets of her bed, as if holding onto her body could somehow anchor me in reality, as if my grief could keep me tethered to the love she had given me. My mind raced through a million thoughts, the why, the how, the what ifs, the endless questioning of everything I had believed about love, about trust, about marriage. And then the laughter came again, a cruel sharp sound that pierced through the room like a knife, slicing through every tender memory I had of him. And it was in that moment that I realized something profound and terrible, that the grief I felt was not just for my mother, it was also for the loss of the man I thought I knew, the loss of the version of him that had existed in my heart, that I had trusted with my life, that had now revealed itself to be a lie. And I felt a fire ignite inside me, a fire that was a mixture of anger, of hurt, of betrayal, of grief, that could not be extinguished by his words, by his excuses, by anything, because the man I loved was gone, and in his place was someone I did not recognize. And I could feel the walls closing in around me, the room spinning as I tried to steady my breath, trying to steady my heart, trying to make sense of the senseless, trying to find a reason why a human being could be so cruel. And I looked around at the faces of my family, at the faces of friends, at the people who had come to mourn with me, and I realized that I was not alone, that my grief was shared by many, but this laughter, this mockery, this lack of empathy, it was mine alone to bear. And in that moment I made a silent vow that I would not let him define my grief, that I would not allow his cruelty to overshadow the love I had for my mother, that I would carry her memory with me and honor her life in every way possible. And I knew then that something had shifted inside me, that I could never go back to the person who had trusted blindly, the person who had given her heart away without question, because the truth had been revealed, and the truth was painful and raw and real, and it was a truth I would carry with me for the rest of my life. And as the day wore on, as the room emptied, as the world moved on around me, I sat there on the floor beside her bed, holding onto her hand one last time, feeling the warmth that had once been there, and letting the tears fall freely, knowing that my grief was mine and mine alone, but also knowing that it had been tested, that it had been mocked, and yet it remained unbroken. And I looked at him one last time, and the fire in my heart burned brighter than ever, a fire fueled by love and loss, by betrayal, and by the unwavering resolve to never let anyone diminish the sacredness of my grief. And in that moment I knew that the path ahead would be difficult, that there would be days when the pain felt unbearable, when the laughter of a cruel person echoed in my mind, when the betrayal felt like a weight too heavy to carry. But I also knew that I had strength, that I had resilience, that I had a love for my mother that was eternal and unshakable, and I would carry it with me through every trial, every heartbreak, every challenge, because that day had shown me the depths of human cruelty, but it had also shown me the depths of my own strength, and I would never forget it. And that is how I lived through the first moments after her death, the moments when grief collided with betrayal and left me raw and trembling, and yet somehow unbroken, a survivor of pain, a witness to cruelty, and a bearer of love that death could not take away. After the shock of seeing him laugh at my mother's death, the disbelief, the rage, the suffocating weight of betrayal, I tried to find answers in my own mind. I tried to convince myself that perhaps I had misunderstood, that perhaps grief had twisted my perception, that perhaps the pain in my heart had created some cruel illusion. But the memory of his smirk, his mocking tone, the way his laughter had echoed in the room refused to fade, and I began to question everything I had known about him, the life we had shared, the moments I had treasured, the promises we had made, and it all came crashing down in waves of confusion so intense that I could hardly breathe. I felt like the floor had been pulled from under me, and I was falling endlessly into a void I could not escape. And I replayed that day over and over in my mind, the moment I had walked into that room, the pale lifeless face of my mother, the smell of antiseptic and flowers, the quiet murmurs of those around me, and then him standing there, his laughter cutting through the air like a blade. Each time it rang out, each time it reverberated in my skull, I felt my heart crack a little more, and I could not comprehend it. How could someone I loved, someone I had shared my most intimate moments with, someone I had trusted with my soul, show such a complete lack of empathy, such a complete disregard for the human heart? I had thought I knew him better than anyone. I had thought he would be my anchor, my shield in moments of despair. I had believed in his capacity for love and compassion, but now doubt gnawed at the edges of my mind, and I started to ask questions. I tried to analyze his behavior. I tried to find patterns in our history that might explain this cruelty. Maybe he had always been like this. Maybe I had missed the signs. Maybe grief had revealed the darkness that had been hidden beneath the surface. All these thoughts collided in my mind, creating a storm of confusion, anger, and sadness, and I could feel my trust slipping away like sand through my fingers. Each memory I had cherished suddenly tainted by the realization that the man I thought I knew was perhaps not the man I had married, and I began to feel a sense of denial that maybe if I looked hard enough, if I searched long enough, I could find the man I loved hiding behind that cruel laughter. But every time I tried to convince myself of that hope, every time I tried to believe in the humanity I thought I had seen in him, I was met with the cold reality that what I had witnessed was real and unexplainable. And I began to notice the little things, the subtle signs that I had ignored for so long, the jokes at the expense of others, the dismissive glances, the way he seemed to enjoy the discomfort of those around him, a pattern that had been there all along, but that grief had illuminated with brutal clarity, and I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. For not seeing it sooner, for allowing myself to be blind, for believing in a version of him that perhaps had never existed, and the confusion only deepened because I was trapped between love and revulsion, between loyalty and the undeniable truth that his actions were cruel, his laughter was unacceptable, and yet a part of me wanted to justify it, to rationalize it, to find some excuse to cling to the remnants of the man I had known, and I realized that denial was a dangerous companion. It whispered lies, it encouraged false hope, it made me question my own perception, it made me doubt my own sanity, it made me feel isolated in my grief, because how could anyone else understand the complexity of feeling betrayed in the middle of mourning someone you love more than life itself? And I found myself questioning my own reactions, questioning whether my heartbreak was valid, whether my anger was justified, whether my grief was being overshadowed by my own inability to control my emotions. But deep down I knew that my feelings were real, my grief was real, my outrage was real, and the denial was just a mask I was putting on to make sense of something that could not be made sense of. And every time I looked at him, every time I saw his face, every time I heard his voice, I felt the confusion tighten its grip on my chest, squeezing until it hurt to breathe. And I started to notice the way he interacted with others, the subtle condescension, the hidden smirks, the moments of schadenfreude that now made perfect sense. And I realized that perhaps this was not an isolated incident, perhaps the laughter I had witnessed was not a momentary lapse, but a window into the true nature of the man I had married. And the denial began to crumble under the weight of evidence, the memories of shared moments that now felt tainted, the recollections of conversations that took on new meaning, the way he had sometimes made me feel small or dismissed my feelings in subtle ways, all of it converging to show me that what I had witnessed was the tip of an iceberg, a glimpse into a reality I had been too blind or too trusting to see before. And I felt a mix of sorrow and relief, sorrow for the loss of the man I had imagined, relief that the truth was finally visible, even though it hurt more than I had ever imagined possible. And in the silence of that grief, in the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts, I confronted the reality that I could no longer rely on him, that I could no longer trust his empathy, that I could no longer expect compassion from the person I had married. And the confusion turned to anger, a slow burning anger that filled my chest and made me sit up taller even as the tears continued to fall. And I realized that denial and disbelief had been my way of protecting myself from the magnitude of betrayal, from the enormity of grief, from the realization that the foundation of my life had been shaken to its core. And I had to let go of denial, I had to face the truth even if it was unbearable, because living in denial would only prolong the pain, would only allow him to continue hiding behind the facade of the man I had once loved. And so I faced him, I observed him, I scrutinized every word, every expression, every interaction, and I saw it all for what it truly was. I saw the indifference, I saw the cruelty, I saw the lack of remorse, and I understood that my confusion was natural, that it was human, but that it could not dictate my actions, it could not control my life, it could not diminish the love I held for my mother, nor the value of my grief. And I began to take a step back, to process the emotions, to allow myself to feel the grief fully without allowing his actions to overshadow it, without allowing his laughter to define the depth of my pain. And I noticed something else, I noticed the resilience rising within me, the quiet strength that grief often uncovers, the understanding that I could survive this, that I could navigate the storm of betrayal and heartbreak, that I could emerge not broken but transformed. And the confusion began to shift into clarity, clarity that the man I had trusted was not the man I thought he was, clarity that my grief was sacred and untouchable, clarity that his actions did not define my worth or my capacity to love, clarity that I had the right to mourn and to protect my heart. And in that clarity I found a strange sense of empowerment, a sense that even in the midst of disbelief and denial I could reclaim my life, my dignity, my sense of self, that I could honor my mother and her memory without giving power to the cruelty I had witnessed. And so I allowed the confusion to linger just long enough to teach me its lessons, and then I let it go. I allowed myself to accept the truth fully, without flinching, without rationalizing, without pretending that everything was okay, because it was not okay, and it would never be okay with him, but it could be okay with me if I chose to stand tall, if I chose to hold on to my grief as my own, if I chose to trust in my own judgment and my own heart. And in that moment of facing denial, of questioning everything, of feeling the confusion of betrayal and grief together, I felt a sense of awakening, a sense that I was no longer a passive participant in my life, a sense that I could navigate this pain with my eyes wide open, that I could honor my mother with integrity and courage, that I could survive the laughter, the mockery, the cruelty, and still emerge with my soul intact. And that is how I lived through those days of confusion and denial, the days when grief collided with disbelief, the moments when the betrayal of someone I loved seemed too vast to comprehend, and yet somehow I survived. And in surviving I discovered strength I had never known, strength born from sorrow, strength born from heartbreak, strength born from the refusal to let someone else diminish the sacredness of my love and my grief. After the days of confusion and denial, I reached a point where the anger inside me could no longer be contained. It was a fire burning in my chest, a fire that demanded to be acknowledged and confronted, and I realized that I could not simply sit in silence and pretend that his laughter and cruelty had not happened. I could not allow him to continue living in my home, in my life, as if everything were normal, as if the sacredness of my grief could be dismissed with a shrug or a smirk. And so I prepared myself to confront him, to face him and demand the truth, demand accountability for what he had done, and the thought of it made my hands shake, my heart race, and yet beneath the fear there was a sense of determination, a quiet courage that I had not known I possessed, because grief had a way of revealing strength in unexpected places. And I approached him one evening when the house was quiet, when the world outside had no eyes and no ears to witness what was about to unfold, and I looked him in the eyes and I said words that I had rehearsed 1,000 times in my mind, words that carried the weight of sorrow and anger and betrayal, and I demanded to know how he could laugh at my mother's death, how he could show such callousness and cruelty, and I expected him to respond with regret, to apologize, to show at least a shred of humanity, but instead he looked at me with a dismissive smile, a smirk that twisted his face into something unrecognizable, and I felt the anger surge even higher, the fire in my chest becoming a storm that threatened to consume me completely, and I shouted, I yelled, I let the grief and fury pour out of me in words sharp and raw. I told him that his laughter had broken something inside me, that his mockery had shattered my trust, that the man I had married, the man I had loved, was no longer who I thought he was, and still he did not falter, still he did not show remorse, still he did not seem to understand the enormity of what he had done. And I felt the tears streaming down my face, the choking sobs that rattled my chest, and I realized that confrontation was not about changing him, it was not about eliciting an apology, it was about asserting myself, about reclaiming the power that grief had taken from me, about refusing to allow his cruelty to define the boundaries of my pain. And as I spoke, I felt memories flooding back, memories of other moments when he had dismissed my feelings, when he had belittled my concerns, when he had subtly undermined my confidence, and suddenly everything made sense. The laughter at my mother's death was not a momentary lapse, it was a culmination of patterns I had ignored, a revelation of a character I had chosen to overlook because I wanted to believe in the man I had married, and the realization fueled the fire in my chest even more, and I demanded answers, not because I expected him to change, but because I needed to hear the truth spoken aloud, to validate my own experiences, to acknowledge the depth of betrayal I had endured. And he shrugged, he mocked, he minimized, and I felt a rage unlike anything I had ever known before, a rage that burned through my grief and threatened to consume everything around me. And yet beneath the anger there was a deeper pain, a pain that spoke of love lost, of trust destroyed, of innocence shattered, of the life I had imagined crumbling before my eyes. And I realized that confrontation was not only an act of defiance, it was an act of survival, an act of self-preservation, because if I did not stand up to him, if I did not assert the reality of his cruelty, I would be swallowed by it, I would allow it to define me. And so I stood tall, even as my body trembled, even as my voice shook, even as the tears continued to fall, and I spoke with clarity and conviction. I told him that his laughter was unacceptable, that his mockery was inexcusable, that my grief was sacred and untouchable, and still he did not understand, still he did not see the depth of the wound he had inflicted. And I realized then that sometimes people never change, that sometimes confrontation is not about correction, it is about illumination, about making the darkness visible, about asserting your own truth in the face of someone else's cruelty. And I felt a strange empowerment rising inside me, empowerment born from the courage to face the man I loved and call him out, empowerment born from the refusal to let grief be silenced by mockery, empowerment born from the knowledge that I had a right to demand respect even in the most vulnerable of moments. And as the confrontation continued, as I laid bare my sorrow, my anger, my disbelief, I noticed the subtle shifts in his demeanor, not remorse, not guilt, but unease, the first cracks in the facade of arrogance and cruelty, the recognition that he could not hide from the truth forever, that the words I spoke had weight that they could not ignore. And I felt a sense of vindication, a quiet satisfaction that my grief had not been dismissed, that my pain had not been invisible, that my voice had not been silenced. And I realized that confrontation was a necessary act, a cleansing act, a moment of reckoning that allowed me to reclaim my power, to reclaim my dignity, to assert that my grief was mine and mine alone. And even though the confrontation did not bring apologies, it did not bring tears, it did not bring the acknowledgement I had hoped for, it brought something just as important. It brought clarity, the clarity that I was not alone in my pain, that I had the right to speak, that I had the strength to stand, that I had the courage to face cruelty head on. And in the days and nights that followed, I reflected on that confrontation, I replayed the words I had spoken, the fury I had expressed, the tears I had shed, and I realized that it had transformed me, that it had changed the way I saw myself and him, that it had created a boundary that could not be crossed, that it had drawn a line between love and betrayal, between empathy and cruelty, between grief and mockery, and I felt a sense of relief that I had finally spoken the truth, that I had finally demanded accountability, that I had finally faced the man I had trusted and shown him that his actions had consequences even if he could not comprehend them. And I began to notice the subtle changes in myself, the newfound strength, the heightened awareness, the refusal to tolerate disrespect, the ability to assert my own reality even in the face of someone else's indifference. And I understood that confrontation was not a single act but a process, a journey, a series of choices that allowed me to reclaim my grief and protect my heart. And I felt a sense of peace mixed with lingering anger, a recognition that I had survived the storm, that I had faced the cruelty that I had endured, and had emerged with my sense of self intact. And even as I continued to grieve my mother, even as I continued to navigate the pain of betrayal, I knew that I was stronger for having confronted him, stronger for having faced the truth, stronger for having refused to allow his laughter and mockery to define the depth of my love and the sanctity of my loss. And in that confrontation I discovered something profound, something life-altering, the realization that grief is not a weakness, that vulnerability is not a flaw, that standing up to cruelty is not just an act of defiance but an assertion of humanity and dignity. And I knew then that no matter what came next, no matter how he responded, no matter how the world judged, I had done what was necessary. I had spoken my truth, I had faced betrayal, I had honored my grief, and in that moment of confrontation I found the beginning of empowerment, the first steps toward reclaiming my life and my heart, the understanding that even in the presence of cruelty, even in the face of mockery, even in the shadow of betrayal, I could remain whole, I could remain strong, I could remain unbroken. And that is how I lived through the confrontation with the man I loved, the man who had laughed at my mother, the man who had betrayed my trust, the man who had shown me cruelty in its rawest form. And even though it was painful, even though it was exhausting, even though it left scars that would never fully fade, it was necessary and it was transformative. And it was the moment when grief collided with anger and clarity and strength to reveal the resilience I had within me, the power I had within me, the unwavering courage that would carry me forward no matter what the future held. The tension in the house had been thick for days, the kind of tension that makes every breath heavy, that makes every step feel measured, that makes every glance at him a battle between anger and disbelief. I had confronted him, I had spoken my truth, I had demanded accountability, and yet he remained stubborn and unrepentant, silent in the ways that mattered, laughing in ways that were unbearable. But then one afternoon the unexpected happened. His boss arrived, a man whose presence carried authority, a man whose reputation preceded him, a man whose steps in the hallway sounded like judgment echoing through the walls. And I did not know what to expect. I did not know if this visit was routine or if fate had conspired to deliver some form of justice or if it was simply coincidence. But the moment he walked into the room, the air shifted, the very energy of the house changed, as if some unseen force had come to observe and pass judgment. And I watched him carefully, noting the way his eyes took in the room, noting the way he paused, noting the subtle furrow of his brow, the quiet intensity in his gaze. And I realized that this man saw more than what was being said. He saw the tension, he saw the grief, he saw the cruelty, he saw the betrayal. And I felt a glimmer of hope stir within me, a hope that perhaps someone else could witness the injustice that had been done, and perhaps someone else could validate the pain that I had endured alone in my grief. And as he addressed my husband, his voice calm, measured but firm, the room seemed to hold its breath. And I listened as the words were spoken, words that carried weight, words that carried authority, words that cut through the facade of arrogance and cruelty that my husband had built around himself. And I could see it in his eyes, the subtle shift, the flicker of unease, the recognition that he could not hide from this man, could not feign ignorance, could not pretend that his actions had been acceptable. And I felt a surge of relief mixed with anticipation, a sense that the universe had conspired in that moment to reveal the truth, to expose the cruelty and make him confront the reality of what he had done. And the conversation continued, the boss speaking with precision, with clarity, pointing out the lack of empathy, the disregard for human emotion, the unacceptable behavior, the laughter that had shattered the sanctity of grief. And I watched my husband squirm, his posture stiffening, his hands fidgeting, his eyes darting, unable to meet the gaze of the man who commanded respect, unable to reconcile the person he pretended to be with the reality of his actions. And I felt a strange sense of vindication, that someone else could see what I had been forced to endure alone, that someone else could articulate the words I had been too overwhelmed by grief and anger to fully express, that someone else could make him feel the weight of accountability that I had demanded and yet he had evaded. And I realized then that sometimes the truth needs a witness, that sometimes confrontation recognition is not enough, that sometimes the presence of another can illuminate the darkness that denial and arrogance have created, and I could see it in the way the boss spoke, in the firmness of his tone, in the steady unwavering gaze that demanded honesty and integrity, and I felt a wave of empowerment wash over me, because in that moment I was no longer alone in my grief, no longer silenced by his mockery, no longer isolated in my sorrow, but supported by the undeniable truth that the universe had sent someone to observe, to witness, to speak. And I watched as the words sank in, as the reality became undeniable, as the cracks in his facade widened, and I saw the first signs of remorse, the subtle downward tilt of his head, the avoidance of direct eye contact, the tension in his jaw, and I realized that while I had confronted him out of anger and grief, this intervention, this unexpected presence was different. It carried a weight that could not be dismissed. It carried authority, it carried observation, it carried judgment, and I felt a quiet satisfaction that sometimes justice is not loud, it is not explosive, it is subtle, it is delivered through the awareness of another, it is the recognition that actions have consequences, that laughter at grief is not without cost, that cruelty cannot hide forever. And the boss continued speaking, pointing out the emotional cruelty, the impact of his laughter, the way it had violated the sanctity of mourning, and I watched my husband shrink in his own guilt, his arrogance faltering, his bravado dissolving, and I felt a deep sense of relief that the power dynamics had shifted, that the balance had changed, that the scales of justice had tilted in favor of truth and empathy. And in that moment I realized something profound, that sometimes the presence of another is all it takes to reveal the truth, that sometimes people show their colors not when confronted by those they have wronged, but when someone else watches, someone who cannot be swayed by manipulation, someone who sees through pretense, someone who speaks with authority. And I could feel my own heart lifting slightly, the weight of his cruelty lessening as the boss articulated the reality I had been forced to endure alone, the coldness, the mockery, the laughter, and I could sense the tension in my husband's chest, the internal reckoning, the understanding that he could no longer dismiss the impact of his actions, the awareness that his behavior was being observed, judged, and acknowledged. And I felt a sense of validation for the first time since the day my mother passed, that the grief I had carried was real, that my pain was acknowledged, that the laughter that had cut through my soul had consequences that could not be denied. And I listened as the conversation continued, as the boss laid out the expectations, the boundaries, the understanding that human decency must prevail even in moments of personal grief. And I felt a profound sense of clarity, that sometimes the universe intervenes in mysterious ways, that sometimes the presence of an observer can reveal the truth that confrontation alone cannot. And I watched my husband nod subtly, shift his posture, show the first signs of understanding, the recognition that his actions were unacceptable, and I felt a spark of hope that perhaps he would begin to change, perhaps he would recognize the gravity of his behavior, perhaps he would see the pain he had caused and the grief he had disrespected. And as the conversation concluded, the boss's presence slowly receded, the authority lingering in the room, the awareness of truth etched into the atmosphere, and I felt the weight in my chest lighten slightly, the tension in my heart ease, as I realized that the intervention had done what my confrontation alone could not. It had revealed the truth, it had exposed the cruelty, it had demanded accountability, and I felt a sense of empowerment knowing that even in the darkest moments of grief, even in the presence of betrayal, even in the shadow of cruelty, the universe has a way of delivering justice. The truth will be revealed, the actions of the heart will be seen, and I could sense the shift in the air, in the room, in my own spirit, that the laughter that had haunted me would no longer have power, that the cruelty that had threatened to define my grief was being confronted in a way that demanded recognition. And I understood then that sometimes the lessons of life are revealed not through our own efforts alone, but through the presence of others, through the unexpected arrival of someone who sees what we cannot ignore, who speaks what we cannot fully articulate, who holds the mirror up to reality in a way that no denial or arrogance can distort. And I felt a sense of relief, that I had not been wrong, that my grief had been valid, that the laughter had been unacceptable, that my pain had been seen and acknowledged. And as the day turned to evening and the house returned to silence, I reflected on what had happened, the presence of his boss, the firmness of his words, the shift in my husband, the validation of my own experience, and I realized that this moment would remain etched in my memory, not as a relief from grief, not as an end to pain, but as a turning point, a moment when cruelty was confronted by authority, a moment when laughter at grief could not hide, a moment when truth revealed itself in the most unexpected way. And I knew then that life had a way of balancing the scales, that justice does not always arrive in the ways we expect, that sometimes it comes quietly, subtly, through observation, through accountability, through the awareness of someone who can cannot be swayed, and I felt a renewed sense of strength, a sense that even in the midst of grief, even in the presence of betrayal, even in the shadow of cruelty, I had allies, I had witnesses, I had truth on my side, and I could carry that forward with me. I could navigate the days ahead with the knowledge that laughter at grief would not go unchecked, that cruelty would not prevail, that my grief was sacred and unassailable. And that is how I lived through the arrival of his boss, the moment when authority intervened, when observation revealed truth, when laughter and mockery could no longer hide. And in that moment I realized that the power of truth sometimes comes from the most unexpected sources, the presence of someone willing to see the reality of human behavior, the courage to speak, the unwavering recognition that grief must be honored and cruelty must be confronted. And I felt a sense of justice rising in my heart, a quiet but powerful recognition that even in the midst of heartbreak and betrayal, the truth will always find a way to make itself known. After the confrontation, after the presence of his boss and the undeniable shift in his demeanor, I was left alone with my thoughts. In the quiet moments that followed, the house was still, the weight of grief pressing down on me as heavily as it had in the days before. But now there was a subtle change, a shift in the atmosphere, a realization that something had altered, not in the world around me but within me. And I began to reflect on the aftermath of everything I had endured, the laughter, the mockery, the betrayal, the confrontation, the accountability. And I realized that life had a strange way of teaching its hardest lessons, sometimes through pain, sometimes through cruelty, sometimes through moments that feel unbearable. And I understood that grief is never just about loss, it is about revelation, about understanding, about the depth of human character. And the aftermath was a period of intense self-reflection, a period where I questioned everything about my life, my choices, my relationships, my understanding of love and trust. And I had to confront some uncomfortable truths. I had to acknowledge that the man I thought I knew was not the man he had shown himself to be, that the laughter I had endured was not an isolated incident but a symptom of a deeper disregard for empathy and respect. And I had to face the reality that sometimes the people we love, the people we trust, the people we give our hearts to, are not capable of honoring the depth of our pain. And that realization was both heartbreaking and liberating, because it meant that the grief I carried was valid, the anger I felt was justified, the betrayal I experienced was real, and I did not have to minimize it or excuse it or pretend it did not matter to maintain peace or preserve appearances. And in that understanding I began to see a pathway forward, a way to navigate the aftermath without losing myself, without allowing his cruelty to define the parameters of my life. And I started to take steps to reclaim my own sense of self, to assert my boundaries, to protect my emotional well-being, to recognize that my grief and my love for my mother were sacred and untouchable. And the aftermath also brought clarity about human behavior, about accountability, about the nature of cruelty and empathy. And I realized that sometimes people reveal their true selves not in the grand gestures, not in the moments we choose, but in the quiet moments of grief, in the unguarded seconds when the world is watching and we are most vulnerable. And the clarity was painful because it forced me to reconcile the image of the man I loved with the reality of his actions, to acknowledge that trust had been broken and could not simply be restored with words or apologies. And yet in that clarity there was empowerment, because it reminded me that I had the power to determine my own response, that I had the ability to navigate grief and betrayal with my eyes wide open, that I could assert my own truth even in the face of indifference and cruelty. And I began to notice subtle changes in my own behavior, the way I interacted with him, the way I processed my grief, the way I engaged with the world around me. I was more aware, more vigilant, more protective of my heart. And I realized that this awareness was a gift born from pain, a strength forged in the crucible of betrayal and mourning. And I also noticed the reactions of those around me, the family members, the friends, the witnesses to my grief and the aftermath of confrontation and accountability. And I saw the respect in their eyes, the acknowledgement of my pain, the subtle recognition that I had endured something unimaginable. And I felt a sense of validation that had been missing in the days of solitude and confusion. And I understood that the aftermath is not just about personal reflection, it is about recognition, it is about the shifting of energy in relationships, it is about understanding who in your life can be trusted to honor grief, who can be counted on to see beyond appearances, who will stand by your side when the world seems cruel. And I began to make decisions based on this clarity about the aftermath, about who and what I would allow into my life and the boundaries I would enforce. And in that process I discovered resilience, a resilience I had not known I possessed, a fortitude that allowed me to hold my head high even as the memories of laughter and mockery threatened to drag me back into despair. And I realized that the aftermath of grief and confrontation is not a period of passivity, it is an active engagement, it is a conscious decision to reclaim your life, to assert your dignity, to navigate the pain with awareness and strength. And I felt a deep sense of responsibility to myself to honor my mother's memory, not just through mourning but through living, through assertion, through protection, through empowerment. And the aftermath also brought a heightened sense of discernment about human behavior. I began to see the subtleties, the micro expressions, the small signs that reveal true character. I became attuned to the underlying intentions behind words, behind gestures, behind actions, and this awareness was both protective and enlightening. It allowed me to avoid further deception, to understand motivations, and to safeguard my own heart from further harm. And I also reflected on the nature of accountability, the way it had been enforced by his boss, the way it had shifted the dynamics, the way it had illuminated truth. And I realized that accountability is not always immediate, it is not always perfect, it does not always bring satisfaction, but it is a necessary force, a balancing force, a mechanism through which the world enforces the principles of respect and empathy, even when the perpetrators of cruelty fail to recognize them. And in that understanding I felt a quiet sense of justice, a recognition that while his actions could not be undone, while his laughter could not be erased, while the betrayal could not be unexperienced, the truth had been revealed, the cruelty had been exposed, and the consequences had begun to manifest. And the aftermath also taught me about the power of observation, about the role of witnesses, about the importance of having someone external who can validate pain, who can articulate the truth, who can act as a mirror reflecting reality when our own words may falter. And I felt gratitude for that presence, for the intervention, for the recognition that sometimes the universe delivers its lessons through the eyes of another. And in the quiet moments of reflection I began to integrate the lessons of the aftermath into my own understanding of life: grief, love, trust, betrayal, and resilience. And I realized that moving forward I would carry these lessons with me: the importance of asserting boundaries, the necessity of protecting the heart, the value of witnessing and being witnessed, the significance of accountability, the recognition of cruelty, and the affirmation of empathy. And I felt a sense of empowerment that grew steadily with each passing day, a knowledge that even in the aftermath of heartbreak and betrayal I could remain whole, I could navigate grief with clarity, I could honor my mother's memory with dignity, I could demand respect for my pain and assert my own truth in the face of indifference and cruelty. And I began to take actions that reflected this empowerment. I established boundaries in my marriage, I sought support from those I trusted, I engaged in self-care, I prioritized emotional well-being, I honored my grief through reflection and memory. And in each of these actions I felt a sense of reclamation, a sense that my life was once again mine, a sense that while the laughter of betrayal had left scars, the aftermath of confrontation and accountability had begun to heal them. And I realized that the aftermath is not simply the period after an event, it is the landscape in which growth occurs, the terrain where lessons are learned, where resilience is built, where empowerment is forged. And I embraced it fully, allowing myself to grieve, allowing myself to reflect, allowing myself to reclaim, allowing myself to emerge from the shadow of betrayal with my heart intact and my spirit stronger than ever. And in that process I discovered an unshakable truth that would guide me for the rest of my life: grief is sacred, betrayal is revealing, confrontation is necessary, accountability is transformative, and the aftermath is a crucible through which strength emerges, clarity is born, and dignity is reclaimed. And I felt a profound sense of peace in that knowledge, a sense of readiness to face whatever the future held, a recognition that even in the presence of cruelty, even in the shadow of mockery, even in the depth of grief, I had the power to navigate my life with awareness, courage, and unwavering strength. And that is how I lived through the aftermath and realization, the period of reflection and reclamation, the moments of clarity and empowerment, the understanding that grief and betrayal and confrontation are all part of a journey toward resilience and self-mastery, a journey that honors love and loss and asserts the power of the human spirit in the face of heartbreak and injustice. After the days of grief, after the confrontation, after the intervention of his boss, after the aftermath and the clarity that followed, I realized that healing was no longer just a distant hope, it was a necessity, it was something I had to claim for myself, not for him, not for anyone else, but for me. And I understood that healing is not a linear path, it is not a destination, it is a process, a journey, a deliberate choice to take back your life, to reclaim your heart, to honor the memory of those you love. And I began to embrace that process fully, allowing myself to feel the depth of sorrow, allowing myself to cry without restraint, to remember my mother without guilt, to honor her life through the acknowledgement of my own grief. And I found that in giving myself permission to grieve fully, I also gave myself permission to heal, because grief and healing are intertwined, they coexist, they speak to each other, they demand recognition. And I realized that the more I allowed myself to process my sorrow, the more strength I uncovered, the more resilience I discovered, the more clarity I gained about who I was and who I would no longer allow myself to be in relation to someone who had betrayed me. And the healing was not only emotional, emotional, it was mental, it was spiritual, it was about reclaiming my own sense of self in a world that had been turned upside down by cruelty and mockery, and I began to take deliberate actions to reinforce that healing. I set boundaries that could not be crossed. I asserted my need for respect. I distanced myself from anything that threatened the peace I was striving to achieve, and in doing so I discovered the power of self-protection, the necessity of guarding your heart even from those who once promised to love it unconditionally, and I realized that empowerment comes from within. It does not rely on apologies, it does not depend on recognition, it is cultivated through awareness, through action, through the conscious decision to refuse to allow the actions of others to define your worth or dictate your emotional state. And I found joy in small victories, in moments of clarity, in the awareness that I could navigate my grief without allowing cruelty to overshadow it, that I could honor my mother without allowing betrayal to taint her memory, that I could live fully even in the shadow of heartbreak. And as I continued to heal, I noticed the subtle transformations within myself, a heightened sense of empathy toward others who had suffered, a strengthened intuition about human behavior, a renewed commitment to authenticity, a deeper understanding that life will always present challenges that test your resilience and that your response to them defines the trajectory of your soul. And I began to cultivate habits that reinforced this empowerment: daily rituals of self-care, reflection, journaling, prayer, meditation, or simply taking quiet moments to breathe and acknowledge my own strength. And in these practices I felt a connection to my mother, a sense that she was guiding me, encouraging me, reminding me that love endures beyond death, that grief is a testament to connection, and that the strength I was discovering was a continuation of the legacy she had instilled in me, the values of courage, compassion, and integrity that she had woven into my very being. And I realized that healing is also about reclaiming your narrative. It is about taking control of the story that life has forced upon you, about refusing to let the betrayal define your identity or your future, about asserting that you are more than the sum of the cruelty you have endured. And I began to speak my truth openly to those who would listen, to share my experiences, not to seek pity but to assert reality, to validate the journey of grief and betrayal, and to inspire others who might find themselves in similar situations. And in doing so I discovered the transformative power of voice, the power of being witnessed, the empowerment that comes from articulating your pain and standing firmly in your truth. And I also noticed the healing that comes from self-forgiveness, the release of blame for things I could not control, for the choices I had made out of love for someone who had betrayed me, for the trust I had given freely. And I realized that forgiving myself was an essential part of empowerment. It allowed me to move forward with dignity, with grace, with the understanding that self-compassion is not weakness but a pillar of strength. And as I embraced these lessons I began to see the world differently. I began to see the beauty and resilience in human connection, in empathy, in moments of kindness that exist even in a world that can be cruel. I began to understand that empowerment is not about controlling others, it is about controlling yourself. It is about asserting your agency even when the circumstances are beyond your control. It is about choosing to rise even when you have been knocked down. It is about allowing grief to be honored while refusing to let it consume your life entirely. And I found solace in the knowledge that life continues, that love continues, that hope continues, even in the aftermath of betrayal, even in the shadow of loss. And I began to make decisions that reflected this empowerment. I cultivated relationships that nurtured me. I distanced myself from toxicity. I invested in experiences that brought joy. I pursued personal growth. I honored my mother's memory through living a life of integrity and love. And with each passing day the laughter that had once cut through my soul lost its power. The mockery that had once haunted me became a reminder of my own resilience. The cruelty that had threatened to define my grief became a testament to the strength I had uncovered. And I realized that empowerment is not a final state, it is a continuous practice. It is a series of choices made moment by moment, a commitment to honor yourself, a vow to protect your heart, a dedication to live authentically. And I felt a profound sense of liberation in that understanding, that the past could not hold me hostage, that betrayal could not shackle my spirit, that grief could be honored without allowing it to dictate the totality of my existence. And I began to envision a future where I could embrace life fully, where I could pursue dreams unapologetically, where I could love deeply without fear, where I could navigate challenges with courage and clarity, where I could be a witness to my own strength. And in that vision I felt a sense of purpose, a renewed commitment to living a life guided by integrity, empathy, and resilience. And I understood that healing and empowerment are intertwined, they feed each other. sustain each other, strengthen each other, and that the more I cultivated healing, the more empowerment I discovered, and the more I embraced empowerment, the deeper my healing became, and I felt a sense of pride in the woman I was becoming, a woman who had faced unimaginable grief, who had confronted betrayal, who had demanded accountability, who had navigated the aftermath with clarity and courage, who was reclaiming her life with dignity and strength. And I realized that the lessons I had learned were not just for me, they were for anyone who has ever been betrayed, anyone who has ever endured grief, anyone who has ever struggled to reclaim their voice and their power. And I felt a responsibility to carry those lessons forward, to share them, to live them as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And in embracing this journey of healing and empowerment, I discovered an unshakable truth, that no one can diminish your grief, but no one can define your worth, but no one can take your power unless you allow it, and that even in the shadow of cruelty, even in the face of betrayal, even in the depths of sorrow, you can emerge whole, strong, unbroken, and capable of loving yourself and the world with renewed clarity and compassion. And that is how I lived through the process of healing and empowerment, how I transformed grief into strength, how I turned betrayal into insight, how I reclaimed my life, my heart, my dignity, and how I discovered that the true power of the human spirit lies not in avoiding pain, but in navigating it with courage, grace, and unwavering strength. And in that empowerment I found peace, purpose, resilience, and the ability to continue forward, honoring the past, cherishing the present, and embracing the future fully and unapologetically.